we just want to tell you some stories. We want to kind of slow down a little bit and to have a purchase on something else, maybe bring material into the room.
And there was also, when we were talking about this, thinking about how stories are very much part of our relationship together as researchers, and the stories that we tell, but also the stories that we share. Caraway talks about stories are essential, but they're never mere stories. And for us, I think that's been quite part of the dynamic of like how our research has developed, but also how our relationship in the researching process has also developed.
Yeah.
Like we come back to certain stories all the time.
So those of you from different spaces, or those of you who have been in MA teaching sessions may have heard stories before, but that's right. We want to return to things because things actually stay as preoccupations, I think. They stay with you when you return, and lots of the things that we're talking about this afternoon are about how we reorder information that we already know. I really like Dennis getting out one paper and then saying that's the other one. But there will have been a relationship between that body of work. And so for us, we thought we would share that. You can interrupt us. It's not meant to be didactic. It might end quickly. It might end at the right time. We're just responsive to things that we have felt and things that we have encountered. And also about this kind of notion of care. So it feels right to follow on from this idea to identify that maybe a solo, even if relational practice involving others can be self-absorbing at times, that you can become part of a particular language and framework. We're interested in those kind of in-between interstitial spaces that maybe you occupy with another researcher that allows you to have a different engagement with what it is that you think you know, thought you knew, or want to encounter.
Yeah, it's also the matter that then also encompass that. The matter of the stuff that we're going to talk about, that I think this has come up as well. It's like what happens in the classroom, why do those things happen? Terry, you talked a bit about that, and I think sometimes we forget that the materials that, when, especially in PhD processes or academic processes, the material encounters and how they rub up or create friction with or create communities amongst what we're talking about and make connections with are really exciting and quite vital. And I think a lot of the time we talk, especially in art, about doing with the materials, but actually it's the materials, the connection with materials, that relationship with the clay or whatever, what we're going to talk about in a bit. That's what's really fascinating about the stories, I think.
Yeah.
It's not the words, it's the matter.
And that our research may be different, and that we occupy different contexts, whether it's within higher educational schools or galleries or museums, but there are these interconnecting threads, which are this kind of unifying state, which I think is what we're really interested in, and the non-binary of art, research, or life, practice. You know, it's actually about a kind of an embodiment of the feeling that we have of being alive, and the small stories. So before we started coming here, just before or just after lunchtime, we went into Tesco's today, and we were looking at Sainsbury's. Good job, I'm not sponsored. We looked at the type of wipes we might supply, and we were checking whether they were biodegradable and what that might mean. We said that's really important, and the man behind the counter said why. We said, well, we're just about to be in a space which is about, you know, ecologies in a broader sense, and he said you really have to watch this film on Netflix, which is about sharks and the sea, and he became alive by this conversation, and we thought that's as part of this situation as other stories that we're going to go on to tell now.
He couldn't come though.
He couldn't come because he was working till 5. Okay, so some time ago, me and Claire spent 3 days together at a new materialist conference in Utrecht, exploring, questioning new materialist approaches to thinking, research and practice, materialist ways of being in the world, ways of caring about matter, what we're in and what we're amongst. We listened attentively before delivering our own workshop, as papers were delivered and experiences disseminated through dialogue and imagery. As part of the audience, we sat behind tables in lecture theatres and conference rooms and we talked about materials, we were talking about materials. As we sat and listened, our thoughts shifted to other things, as yours might do now. And I started to notice the types of chairs that were in the room, the way that the clock had stopped, the odd woven texture of a jacket on someone in front of me. We were listening to the presentations, but more aware and more interested in the environment we were occupying. The material engagements discussed felt tidied up, ironed out. Matter and its messy implications that we mentioned earlier in Molly's presentation were ever so neatly presented, as though the problematic entanglements were taking place somewhere else, but we couldn't ignore them. In between the papers, we dispersed alone or in groups, and me and Clare would go to the same cafe, Cafe Carla, and buy tea and cake. And I would always have the peppermint tea, and its physicality fascinated me. The cup was filled with boiling water, and then it was stuffed full of the largest bunch of mint leaves. The whole plant plunged upside down into the cup. But not just the leaves of the plant, but the unwieldy stalks as well. The lid with the sipping spout was put onto the cup, and the stalks were forced through the sipping hole and brazenly stuck out cup like organic set of straws. The status of abstracted material engagements we'd witnessed in the lectures felt diminished by this live peppermint encounter in Cafe Carla. We were tuned into the peppermint and the sensorial encounter that emerged through an attentive closeness to a plant and some boiling water. Every day that we returned to that cafe, we would also notice a cake or a loaf which was next to the biscuits, and we imagined that it was a banana loaf as it seemed to have different textures within it. On the last day, we bought slices of cake and sat in the cafe, a plunge plant and a slice of mystery cake. As the waitress gave us the cake, she looked at us and asked if we knew what the cake was, which is a strange thing to ask when you buy a cake anyway. Just to ask if we knew what we had ordered. We only knew it was cake. And she went on to tell us the cake story, and she began. At the end of every day, we collect all the cakes that have been brought, and that haven't been brought, and we put them together, and they are made into a new cake. This cake is all the uneaten cakes from yesterday. Every day the cake is slightly different, dependent on what is left, what was rejected, in a sense what I felt had been undigested. The cake story became important as a material metaphor. It's an entanglement of cake. The ingredients of the cake were cake. It felt as though the event of this cake's reforming and reordering was the perfect material analogy, a way of rethinking the same thing, a reordering of stuff in order to try it out again. I thought about this pedagogically. A problem-solving event, a pedagogical metaphor. If you can't digest something in this form, if it's too much and too rich, too complex, what if I present it in a different order? Does it become easier to have, to accept, to digest, and to understand the experience of it? I wanted to run back into the conference with the cake in my hands as some form of declaration. It was a material fit, formed and reformed. The cake was old and new cake, old and new idea, a re-engagement with what was already there. As Alan Caprow often says, attention alters what is attended. More than the didactic delivery of the conference papers, this cake was continually performing between itself and other, like a cake palette. It was represented with the hope that its ingredients might be taken on, digested a second time round. We wondered how they had made it, and we speculated, and we found out later.
So this reordering of cake is a metaphor for like the reordering of our practice or relationships or our life. Like there's only so much stuff in the world, and you can only reorder what you've already got. And that idea of how you then work with whatever it is, whichever context you're working within, or whatever lives that you're living, we're constantly going through that process all the time anyway. Although when I found out that the cake was made out of other cake, I found that quite neat. It was very nice cake though.
A little dry, a little dry.
It's quite hard to then digest the cake. It felt there's something uncomfortable about the cake, knowing where it's come from. But I think that's also quite a nice metaphor for sometimes when we are reordering the stuff of our lives, there's a discomfort within that. There's a, we often have to regurgitate something because it doesn't taste quite nice. But we have to still deal with it because that stuff is still there within us. And so that process of digesting materials, how we digest like theory, how we digest anything, or if we're reordering something in terms of, Dennis, what you took on, the idea of decolonisation, or like that's an uncomfortable thing that we've been digesting over years and years and years. It's all of those things put back together over and over, but if we become uncivilised or decolonised, it's how can we reorder those things to make them more palatable for us to digest?
Yeah, and that kind of notion that we started to kind of see that the customers coming in were the group, were the participants in this engagement, in this digestion, in this new knowledge of cake. So for us it became something quite important and something that kind of links onto all of the other stories that we're going to talk to you about today. I suppose this notion really is about, and I'm interested in the kind of conversations that have come up about Barad and intra-action today, and although there isn't time to kind of talk about it now, it's interesting that Tim Ingold, the anthropologist, talks about this idea of moving from interaction to correspondences, and that correspondences are about a kind of interstitial difference. And so all of these kind of terms where we try and say the thing that is kind of lived. And I suppose the idea for us was that the cake was an embodiment of what we were feeling and what we were thinking, what we were trying to articulate. So yes, these kind of conversations have kind of continued. Maybe that will lead on to the Tim Ingold quote.
Maybe. Okay, so this is a quote from Ingold which we found was particularly resonant for today. And he says, "Let me take you by the hand. It is a supremely human gesture, and in it, you and I are joined. We hold on to one another. We go along together. In the linking of hands, palms meet palm, while fingers bent to form a hook, literally interdigitate." You couldn't say that the other day, had you?
And so if we hold on to that now, and with the awareness of how you may feel and not want to share anything, or how you may feel about an environment of potential COVID, we would ask if you feel comfortable to share your play with someone else, swap your play with somebody else. And if you don't feel comfortable to do that, please can you just do something else or different, or swap hands to where it was a minute ago, so that you still keep remaining with the material in your hand.
It was cute.
I stopped there, but yeah, we'll do again.
Sorry, thank you.
No, it's not. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you what it was.
I have.
There is the pressure now of what have you done with your play.
Yeah.
You can feel that people are having to justify their play. Anyway, Tim Ingold goes on to say, "Caught in each other's flexion, the pull of my hand on yours or yours on mine only tightens the grasp. Contrary motion holds us fast. Is this, as generations of theories have taught us, an expression of social solidarity? Hand and mind, after all, are inseparable. So when I join my hand with yours, our minds also meet."
I think what's really interesting is looking around and how actually what we do through a simple act is interrupt the habitual way that we may, it's a new word, listen or be attuned to the circumstances that we're in. I'm reminded within one of my research sessions that somebody was walking around the gallery at Tate with one of my objects in their hand and said, to begin with, "I feel quite uncomfortable because I'm used to holding my phone and making notes." And then he said, "And now I'm making notes with this." And there's that really interesting thing about how we might capture something, or how we think through a material, or think through the idea of holding on to something, that we don't have to fear letting go, because it can stay with us, or that some things remain. We will probably be under your fingernails for the rest of the evening.
But you'll also be with each other, because obviously your particles of skin will now be on the clay, which we can now share with others. So this is slowly becoming an ecology of practice in this room, which is quite interesting. So, and my hands are so dry from the clay, I can't take paper. Okay. Okay, so a story about the skin now. So what happens when we consider the world around us from different perspectives? How does the idea of the classroom, pedagogy, schemes of learning, the Anthropocene shift when we think about this through the skin? And I want to start just with a quote from Natasha Myers. Never forget this, your body does not end at the skin. Your contours are not constrained by physical appearance. Your morphological imaginary is fluid and changeable. Indeed, your tissues can absorb all kinds of fantasies. Your imagination generates more than mere mental images. Its reach extends through your entire sensorium, simultaneously visual and kinesthetic. Imaginings carry an effective charge. They can excite your muscles, tissues and fascia, heighten and alter your senses. You can fold semiosis into sensation. Perceptual experiments can re-articulate your sensorium, and by imagining otherwise and telling different stories, you can open up new, sensible worlds. And the skin, for me, has allowed some of that kind of opening up of something. And to return to that idea of what Dennis was talking about with the statues, thinking about that through art history, the skin offers, for me and the practice I've been exploring, ways of thinking through those past histories to reimagine and relearn and unlearn with them, and to put our skin into a context. And this is the bit I really love, I find fascinating. We have approximately 1.6 trillion skin cells at any one time. 30 to 40,000 of them will fall away every hour, so just think about this room from that specific viewpoint. We will all be shedding microscopic skin cells as you sit and have sat throughout this day amongst each other. The physical fact is obviously rarely pondered upon on a day-to-day basis, but doing so offers a gateway into a post-human world, a Bredottian world, a world filled with critters and skin mites, one that morphs and changes constantly, that offers new ways of thinking about pedagogical practice. So what would happen if we thought about a scheme of learning in terms of the context of the skin? What if we thought about the structures that we work within in terms of the striatas that form the surface of our skin? So the story of the skin cell, the story of the skin cell is a story of intra-action, a constant ebb and flow of human and post-human entanglements. It is a story of the very fabric of our being, a cell story, not one but multiple, interlocking, bubble wrap, mimicking structures, vast, malleable matter. It is at the dermatological base of our skin where this begins as one cell remains to divide over and over again, whilst the others travel upwards, morphing through biochemical changes, swelling with a fibrous protein or keratin that slowly fills up the structure, stretching boundaries as the journey continues upwards. As this journey continues, the cell morphs, stretches out from its centre. The nucleus begins to degenerate, secreting a gooey matter which contains lipids, cholesterol, free saturated acids, and ceramides. Fluids shift around and fill the spaces between each of the other skin cells on this same trajectory. They join forces to form a protective barrier, a stratified and squamous, scaly frontier. This one microscopic cell is now part of a giant organ, a sensing, agentic, multi-layered membrane, at once connected but also in a process of leaving. The skin cell is not secure, just a moment in a cycle of constant repetition, a constant becoming, sloughing, shedding, awaiting and sensing the beginning of the next cycle, departing and arriving, one in a multitude. So this journey can perhaps be terminated here, and is perhaps terminated here in a colonial sense, but it's perceived as flat, dead in biological terms, sealed in art historical terms. But there is a great swell of activity that creeps and crawls within the very surfaces that are deemed as flat and sealed. With the seemingly dry, cracked desert of our outer surface, our forces unbeknown to the human eye, streams of microbacterial life surge between our nooks and crannies, micro-collaborations that crawl through and with us. You are part of a collaboration and an interaction. You are more than human assemblage all the time. The journey of the skin is therefore not concluded, not limited to the human body. and soon to be ruptured, floating free, extending the surface beyond, diversified, dissolved, disintegrated, all but matter, flecks of what once was treasured in its glory days as skin, pampered, washed, oiled, now nothing but dust. But it is in these micro worlds of our human selves that we also become other. And as Briscoe states, grains of skin, human dust, migrate in eddies as we breathe them in, so even in the essence of our neighbours, tints our bloodstreams. So not only are we part of the clay, but you are also part of each other as you breathe in the dust from each other's bodies. And when you think about that in terms of our history or decolonisation, it opens up a different way of thinking about the possibilities.
And that notion of the kind of constant relationality, of that non-separateness that we are all entangled in. And I think what's interesting is how me and Claire's research, although we're not really talking about it specifically today, we're talking about it specifically today because these are our stories. And so it's interesting the things that maybe we do return to and how they resonate at different times for different feelings or different meanings. And so this kind of idea of neighbours, or neighbours in our bloodstreams, links very clearly with my next story, which is that just before I began my PhD, my father donated one of his kidneys to my mother. It was a multi-layered exchange and an embodied entanglement of reciprocity and hope. However, the relevance of this narrative is not concerned with the close, or not only concerned with the close relationship I have to the story and the deep significance within my family. The material exchange between correspondent bodies in a transplant, an extraordinary human and non-human event, offers rich metaphors for change, attention and care. The exchange between people and reordered matter opens up a thinking space to consider the transformative potential of bodies and objects in processes performed and choreographed. So the kidney that was once my father's still lives in the same house as him. It still has the same function. It's just a few metres away, located within another body, my mother's. Neither recipient or donor have ever seen this extracted organ that is fundamentally locatable and fundamentally present, and you may also have it in your mind now. Neither recipient or donor know this organ, but the organ's successful functioning is responsible for my mother's physical well-being and for their shared sense of emotional well-being, two bodies remaining physically and perpetually entangled through the relationship with a reordered object organ. In my research, I go on to think about the possibility of how this organ sits within a disorganised disequilibrium of a body without organs, but that's far too complicated for now. Always connected through this transformative event where habitual bodies were unpacked and reordered, more active, more vital. The organisation of organs and the organisation of life post-transplant is almost the same, but the endings and beginnings of two bodies and several family minds have inextricably enmeshed. Perception has been very much transformed and shifted. Whilst the transplant speaks of particular bodies, critically for this discussion we're focused on the potential for redistribution, reordering, rethinking, responsibility and re-engagement. For some considerable time, this organ object took centre stage in our lives, like this. Many activities were orientated around this thing. This magnified attention created a mental picture of the kidney as a larger and more exaggerated version of itself. Its status grew, it was needed, it was worried about, it was coveted, it was imagined. At various points it was imagined within my father, imagined being removed, imagined outside of my father, and pictured held between both bodies. In a statement from my parents' surgeon that he was merely a plumber, the extraordinary and the impossibility of exchange became materially evened out and made ordinary. When I received a text from my friend 6 months later, whose husband had donated his kidney to their daughter, it read, "The kidney is in the cab," as it moved between hospitals. The unfamiliar then becomes familiar as bodies were plumbed, matter lifted and repositioned. Matter simultaneously matters and sits amongst us, but also changes in its perception and our perception of it. The organ's plumbing in process was imagined, as was its surgical sealing, inside my mother. It was imagined as both being accepted and under threat of the rejection of my mother's body. All the while it remained the same core material object. That didn't change, its function didn't change. It had that specific physical function, but its virtually perceived presence was set in flux through multiple layers of relational activity and invisible material enactments, invisible to us, that is. According to Karen Berard, who's been drawn on a lot today, it could be suggested that our attention and focus changed the organ's kind of agential status. Its physiological and emotional affordance increased through a deepening investment in it. Could we say that the object had afforded different relations during and since the transplant process? It was as if the perception of the object's agency was realigned and its potential for changing our living circumstances increased. Our attention and our care can be located on a kidney, on cake, on a body of clay, a handful of it, a forest, or our skin. The telling of this story might enable us to consider and share the ways in which embodied transformative acts that are enacted on, with, and through materiality might cause corresponding shifts in agency and perception.
When we were talking about this the other day, in the Zoom call, and we were talking about the cake and the body and everything, and I had this strange recollection, because we both really like etymologies of words, for half of the time is looking on Google to see what things was, and I had this vague recollection that cake was, so the etymological link was within the body, and when we looked at it up, it's actually the placenta in, what was it, in Latin?
Yeah.
So and again, that idea of the placenta feeding and nourishment and also being re-eaten at some point in some cultures, or redigested, become again sort of entangles within.
It came from the Roman flat bread bun, and then we just thought it was like bun in the oven. So it's really interesting. So you can see how this kind of kidney skin cake menu, don't come to us for dinner, that's all I do.
Yeah, so cake is placenta, skin is the dust of our neighbours, transplant is the repositioning of plant, ingested, consumed, reordered. And Manning, to draw on her again, she's also in a highlight today, she states, attention flags, body fatigue, stomachs growl. It is remarkable the extent to which the conventional genres of artistic and academic encounters disregard these basic facts. It was important to us to attend to these constraints and build them into each event through a commitment to managing this most prosaic, biopolitical dimension of the encounter as a hospitable manner as possible.
It was really interesting this morning. I was on the train coming here and I had an email come through from Sense Lab and Basecamp, which Erin Manning obviously constructs and is involved in, and a really interesting space of kind of thought and research and action. And on it, she was talking about a scent event, and there was a recipe there for making vinegar. And I thought, only this morning could I be excited about the possibility of making vinegar, but the vinegar being used actually for an event that was going to happen. So I think for us what's really interesting is sometimes the smallest things are the most powerful, and then the most powerful things made ordinary kind of enable there to be this different hierarchical relationship that we can have with the ways that we think about things. And all of these things for us obviously link inextricably back to our practice and pedagogy. But I think it's interesting that the artist group Monoha, the Japanese artist group Monoha, say you can only blow the dust off what already exists. You can't make anything new. Yeah, you can only blow the dust off what already exists to see the world more clearly. And I think that that's what's a really interesting thing. It's about that deeper attention and care, and that care can be that looking and a re-looking, repositioning, reordering, and a concentration on that. So those things have kind of come together, and I suppose it leads on to, do you want me to read the
Yes, you can do. Do you want me to? Yeah, you do. Okay. So yeah, just go back to that idea of blowing the dust off what already exists. And again, we had quite a long conversation around that really lovely quote from Whitehead about have a care, here is something that matters. And I think it is that thing about, you talk about these ideas of blowing dust off, or who is the person that is blowing the dust off what, and within those conversations, who is it who has the agency to do that? And therefore, when you're having a care, whatever other person's grips in your hand, how are you attending to that notion of care? How do we care? And again, etymology of care lies in anxiety, interestingly. So this idea of care comes from something that within friction, within the fact that it's an uncomfortable feeling to care, because there's worry attached to that. And I think within all of these practices and the pedagogical practices and thinking about things from a different point of view, how we hold those spaces, to care for those spaces is quite interesting when you think of it within these very entangled groups. So to talk about how all of these things in the cake, how we make space within this to think through the matter, how you create what Massumi described as the wriggle room, how you, especially in academic institutions, how do you make those spaces to think through matter and materiality when you're in a neoliberal institution which restricts you. And he talks about effect. I use the concept of effect as a way of talking about the margin of maneuverability, the where we might be able to go and what we might be able to do in every situation. One of the reasons it's such an important concept for me is because it explains why focusing on the next experimental step rather than the big utopian picture isn't really settling for less. It's not going for more either. It's more like being right where you are, more intensely. Having some potentials available intensifies our lives. We are not enslaved to our situations. Even if we never have our freedom, we are always experiencing a degree of freedom, or wiggle room. And that, again, is where our research sits. It's within that margin of maneuverability within the institutional spaces of how we can care for, think with, or through material encounters, such as the cake.
So to return to the beginning and to finish off this not workshop, what was interesting is coming back from Utrecht, the cake staying in our heads. It was just a kind of ongoing thing, and I just couldn't stop thinking about how they made it, you know. And so I went online and tried to find pictures of the cake, and I was saying to Claire, have you got any pictures of the cake? Why would you have taken pictures of the cake? I did have one picture of the cake, but I was looking online, and on the MA that I was teaching on, I was asking the students there whether they had ever had it, and some people that lived in the Netherlands, and I was going, is it like a cultural cake? You know, do you know? Anyway, I think people were just going, can you just now? But I looked online and I found where they existed, got the address for Cafe Carla, and I emailed them. And I emailed them as an artist and as a researcher and as a lecturer in English. Nothing. I said, oh, I'm really interested in, your cake. I'm thinking about it in terms of my research. And I said to my husband, oh, I didn't hear anything. And he said, and why are you surprised? You know, why are you surprised? And so I emailed again, and I emailed as a mother, and I emailed about the fact that I wanted to make it at home. And this wasn't a lie, but this was just about another reordering of information. And I went on Google Translate and made sure that it was written in Dutch rather than English. Who knows if it was quite right. But I sent that off, and I got a reply, and this is what we wanted to end with today. I can also not turn the pages. She says, Dear Kimberley, we take all the leftovers. If it's too much bread, she says much bread. If it's too much bread, we put in some more apple, raisins and sugar. Otherwise, we take 60% eggs, 40% milk. It has to be like a dough, not too wet, not too dry, just in the form that's right, and bake it brown. Your fantasy is the limit, she said. Use your imagination. And, you know, I still get a little shit out of that. So this kind of idea that I suppose today some people have used the word data or information, or this is my research gatherings. I think it's really interesting for us to say, well, where does that actually happen? You know, does it happen in an email to a coffee shop? Does it happen with a grasp of a clay? Does it happen when I hold Claire's hand? Does it happen when I'm breathing in your sloughed off skin? You know, that's what it is. And I think that's the thing, that we can talk about boundaries, and we can talk about blurring, and we can talk about interaction, and we can talk about practice research, but what does that look like, and what does that feel like, and how do we disseminate that in a way that's still lived rather than just re-representing it?
And on that note, I need to, because this clay needs to go back into my classroom so I can use it with my students, but on that note, it's also quite interesting to think about that further entanglement of you are going to now be part of, who knows what's going to be made out of this clay, but you're going to be part of that too. So if you can bring your clay back.
Put it back onto the body of
our budgets are tight. I need it back.
Thank you.